Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Mon nom est Justin.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Justin Weiss. I am the director of the Paris Peace Forum, and I'm happy to be able to welcome you here today. And it's also my pleasure to be the MC today for this opening session of the 6th edition of this forum. To start, I'd like to call on Angel Gurria, the president of the Association for the Paris Peace Forum.
Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, je suis.
Ladies and gentlemen, President, my name is Angel Gurria. I am the president of the Paris Peace Forum, and I'd like to welcome you here at the Palais Brongniart for the 6th edition of the Paris Peace Forum. During these 2 days, we will have around 100 sessions and different working discussions on the most important and pressing topics concerning world governance. And your participation will be crucial in these sessions. The forum opens in an international context that has been very shaken up. In 2022, war returned to Europe with the invasion of Ukraine. And this has had socio-economic repercussions, unjust repercussions, especially on poor countries. In 2023, we saw the very worrying escalation between Israel and Hamas. There is also the very tragic situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as in Sudan and in other parts of our planet, where civilian populations are always the first to suffer. And international humanitarian law is less and less respected. We are paying the price of a peace process that has been stalled for many years in the Middle East, because armed conflicts do need world governance and management. We are seeing the effects of a polarized international system and a UN Security Council that is working with the brakes on. But many of us believe that there is still time to restart the diplomatic dialogue, to save lives, to stop conflicts from spreading throughout the region. And I would like to commend the initiative led by President Macron of organizing a humanitarian conference yesterday, which mobilized humanitarian assistance for the inhabitants of Gaza. I am calling for an end to violence once that the guns are silenced. We need to restart true negotiations for a two-state solution. Here at the Paris Peace Forum, we bring together all countries, but also all the relevant players in order to deal with these conflict issues, in order to improve the coordination of all the actors and all global common goods. We need to define the spaces in which cooperation is necessary, where it is necessary and also possible, such as in the field of fighting climate change, of regulating cyberspace, of dealing with artificial intelligence, or in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to set new standards, and we need to mobilize from a political point of view in favor of our future. We need to seek common ground in a world of rivalry. That is our topic this year. Our goal is to encourage states and all present players to engage in dialogue and to be responsible. I hope that these discussions will be a call to commitments and action, an inspiration for a renewed multilateralism that is adapted to the realities of the 21st century. I would like to wish all of us an excellent forum. Thank you very much.
Merci, Angel.
Thank you, Angel.
Pour introduire la conversation de ce matin, le pape
To set the stage for our conversation today, Pope Francis has sent us a written message, and I'd like to call the Apostolic Nuncio in France, Monsignor Celestino Migliore, to join us on stage in order to read His Holiness's message.
Monsieur le Président de la République, Mesdames et Messieurs,
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen,
du 6e Forum
dear participants of the 6th Forum for Peace. I have the pleasure to be with you this morning and to read the message that His Holiness Pope Francis has addressed to all the participants of this Peace Forum through his Secretary of State. To mark the 6th Paris Peace Forum, His Holiness Pope Francis is happy to reach out to you through this message of encouragement, hoping that this meeting, whose goal is to strengthen dialogue between all continents in order to promote international cooperation and dialogue, can contribute to building a fairer and more peaceful world. This year, the forum takes place in an extremely painful global context. We are powerlessly witnessing a multiplication of armed conflicts with their long procession of suffering, injustice, and sometimes irreversible harms to our common home. And the Pope hopes that this forum can be a symbol of hope. He hopes that the commitments that will be taken here will favor an honest dialogue, a dialogue that is based on listening to the cries of all of those who suffer because of terrorism, of generalized violence and wars. So many scourges that only profit to small groups by nourishing particular interests that are often disguised behind noble intentions. Building peace is a slow and patient work that demands courage and the concrete commitment of all people of goodwill who hold dear the future of humanity and the planet. A sustainable peace is something that is built day by day through recognizing, respecting, and promoting the dignity of humanity and people's fundamental rights, among which the Holy See recognizes with particular importance the right to peace, which is a condition to be able to exercise all the other human rights. This year, that marks the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have to admit that for millions of people on all continents, the persisting gap between the solemn commitments that were taken on the 10th of December 1948 and the present reality still needs to be filled. And sometimes this need is very pressing indeed. How many people, including children, are deprived of their fundamental and primal right to life and physical and mental integrity because of different hostilities between groups in different countries? How many people are because of conflict, deprived of their most basic rights, such as the right to drinking water and healthy food, but also deprived of the right of religion, to health, to decent housing, to a quality education and decent work. How many children are forced to directly participate or indirectly participate in armed conflict and carry the physical, the psychological and spiritual scars of this during their entire lives, while reaffirming the inalienable right to legitimate defense, as well as the responsibility we have to protect those whose existence is threatened. We also have to admit that war is always a defeat for humanity. No war is worth the tears of a mother seeing her child mutilated or die in front of her eyes. No war is worth the loss of life even of a single human being which is a sacred creature that was created in the image of the Creator. No war is worth poisoning our common home, and no war is worth the despair of those who are forced to abandon their homeland and are deprived from one day to the next of their home and from all their family links, from their friends, their communities, and their culture, things that were constructed over generations. Peace is not something that is built with weapons, but through lending a patient ear, through dialogue and through cooperation, which are the only means that are worthy of humanity to solve our differences. The Holy Father would like to reiterate the incessant call of the Holy See to silence the guns, to rethink the production and the trade of these instruments of death and destruction, and to resolutely take the path of a gradual but full disarmament so that we can finally work towards for the triumph of peace. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and the Pope Francis would like your exchanges to be rich and to be fruitful, to allow you to listen to each other and to meet each other, respecting the richness of your diversity, in order to grow a culture of peace and to bear concrete fruits for our solidarity. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Nonce.
Thank you, Nuncio.
Dès 2018, le Forum s'est donné comme objectif.
Since 2018, the Forum's goal has been to create peace for the long term, the peace of tomorrow. But of course, we can't remain insensitive or inactive when it comes to today's tragedies. We don't have the luxury of choosing our struggles. So now I'd like to call on to the stage a young Lebanese activist, Elia Milan, who is a doctoral student in London and is working on issues related to the climate transition. We'll listen to her speak about the current geopolitical tensions and the long-term prospects that are drawing our attention. Mr. President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government, heads of international financial institutions and organizations, ministers, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, and ladies and gentlemen, allow me first of all to tell you in full honesty that you were, for me, for an entire week, at the same time, a subject of torment and enthusiasm. I had to tell you about my vision as a young specialist in the field of energy and climate change on the eve of the COP28 in order to inspire you. But how can I transmit to you the aspirations of an entire generation, me, a simple doctoral student at Imperial College London, coming from from this tiny country that is Lebanon. Of course, being a young woman of my generation, I turned towards social media for inspiration. And in this quest, a trilingual song caught my attention. In 1984, when the war was raging through Beirut, the French journalist Michel Drucker invited a young Lebanese woman, Remy Baldali, to sing this song.
جينا نعيدكم بالعيد منسألكم ليش ما في عنا الأعياد ولا زينة يا عالم أرضي محروقة أرضي حرية مسروقة. I am a child with something to say. Please listen to me. I am a child who wants to play. Why don't you let me? À mon enfance, à mes 4 ans,
To my childhood, to me when I was 4, to my innocence, to the beautiful garden that is Lebanon, I'm calling on you to give back the innocence to my childhood. Please save childhood. As a young woman from the Middle East, I can only address you thinking of all the children who are suffering because of war. The confrontation between Israel and Gaza reminds us tragically at what point peace is precious and needs to be protected. We know this. In this world, the only way out is peace. We cannot give in to hatred. This conflict is a new proof of this. I'm thinking of the thousands of victims of different wars, including Lebanon. On Monday, 3 little girls from southern Lebanon were killed. Their names were Rimas, Talin, and Layan. No earth can bear flowers if it is watered with the blood of children. As a Lebanese person, my generation lived through the trauma of invasion, of war, of financial crises, of corruption, of injustice, and of the explosion that shook our capital, Beirut, on the 4th of August 2020. We are victims of forced departures, leaving behind us our dreams, our families, our customs, and our dear cedar tree. Yes, our dear cedar tree, which sits upon our mountains proud. We are all here united for peace, and it has to be preserved and restored in the Middle East as elsewhere, and quickly. Weapons are louder than our forests, than our oceans, and the biodiversity that lives within them, and yet peace will only be sustainable if we manage, through our collective commitment, to preserve our planet. The results of the Intergovernmental Agency research are not optimistic. According to the IPCC, there's more than 50% a likelihood that the rise in global temperatures will reach or go beyond 1.5 degrees by 2040. Our struggle is thus crucial and timely. We need to join forces in this world of rivalries in which children and future generations are the most vulnerable. We have not been able to safeguard their present, and so we owe them a better future. In this mission, each and every one of us has an important role to play. As an academic, I focus on energy sobriety to decarbonate heavy industry and develop low-carbon hydrogen. This ultimate decarbonization is the most important challenge that your institutions and our youth have to overcome. But don't worry. The young people are here to meet this challenge and to mobilize themselves to build a planet that meets their ambitions on one condition, and that is that they have a seat around your negotiating tables. It is essential to continue to focus our financial resources on decarbonization. Reducing emissions has to be fair and just, and it has to involve all countries, all regions, without leaving anyone behind. During the Paris Summit for a new financial global pact that took place in June of last year, clear intentions were put forward. I think it is time to take action. We have a long road in front of us, and we have no time to lose. I hope that you are ready for a marathon, ladies and gentlemen. It will not be easy to run. Its finish line is either the salvation of humanity or total chaos. Soon we will all meet at the COP28 in Dubai, ready to renew this commitment taken here in Paris 8 years ago. I'm looking forward to be there, aren't you? I'm happy to be here in Paris today for the first time. Victor Hugo was right. To breathe the Paris air preserves the spirit. For everyone, Paris is the capital of lights, the capital of love, the capital of the resistance. I call on Paris to become today, by our common commitment, the capital of peace for people and the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, I have no weapons to fight with, nor a pen to write laws with, but I have my optimism and my faith. I am not dreaming of a utopia, but of something that is concrete and real. I believe in humanity that overcomes all differences. I believe in science that will guide us towards a healthy future. I believe in you that are gathered here today for the best of all causes, you who are open and tolerant. I am convinced that there are better days ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this morning you feel the same energy as I do. And if you have the same flame inside you, and if you really think that there is strength in numbers, then you have an opportunity to seize today. You have the opportunity to write new pages of our common history. You have the opportunity to mobilize your resources for the most noble of causes. You have the opportunity to keep your promises. I wish you fruitful negotiations. Think of the future. Think of us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Comment financer
How are we to finance, at the same time, the goals of sustainable development goals, the fight against poverty, and the green transition, the climate transition? This was the topic of the summit for a new Global Financial Pact that took place here on the 22nd and 23rd of June in this very place. And today we're going to be talking about this point and about the follow-up to that event. At the Paris Peace Forum, we like to monitor and to follow up on things that are launched. We don't like just talking about new things. And we want to make sure that we take action once we've negotiated and pronounced great speeches. So today we have two panels. The first will be devoted to what has been achieved since last June, what has changed, what has been put forward since June. And the second panel will be devoted to what has to be done for the COP in order to be able to move forward. So I'd like to call for the first panel, the President of the Republic, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, as well as the President of the European Council, Mr. Charles Michel, whose presidency is committed for a fast and just climate transition, the Director General of the IMF, Christina Georgieva. As you know, the Bretton Woods organizations were at the heart of the June discussions, and it is at the heart of the debates today on the evolution of the global financial architecture. The President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Chin Li-chun, who is also a member of the Financing Common Coalition, and he will be the host of the next edition of the Global Summit of Finance in Common. This is a concrete demonstration of what it means to work in a network in an ecosystem for development banks. And finally, Dr. N.K. Singh, who is an eminent economist who produced together with Larry Summers an essential report on multilateral development banks for the Indian presidency of the G20. I'd like to invite you all to this stage. Thank you.
Chers amis, merci beaucoup.
Dear friends, thank you, Justin, for this introduction. I'll be very brief. Last summer, we launched the Pact of Paris for people in the planet. It's called the 4 Ps. And it actually comes from an initiative that was launched by Mia Motley, the Bridgetown Agenda. She will be on the second panel. And it's in line with the many previous initiatives. And the general director of the IMF launched it a couple of years ago. It was at the initiative of the Paris Peace Forum. Having more DTS to be reallocated towards countries that needed it the most in Africa. But it all started with an observation. There's a global divide regarding challenges that seemed impossible to reconcile. And many countries in the South have said, you are giving us lessons all the time. You're asking us to solve the climate problem, but you caused it. You're asking us to resolve inequalities problems. So challenges are increasing, and such countries have a lot of security costs to spend because there's instability in their countries, but the means, the resources are not there. So that's the basis. And the Paris Pact for people in the planet relies on 4 simple principles. No one should have to choose between fighting against inequalities and protecting the planet, climate, and biodiversity. Secondly, the path should be chosen by each nation in a sovereign manner. No model should be decided for the whole planet from Washington, D.C., or Brussels, or London, or any capital in the north. Thirdly, in order to do so, we need more financial means, more public financial means. Which means we need to have sufficient ODA, which is necessary. And also, we need to better use our MDBs and our regional banks to mobilize finance. And fourthly, there needs to be a complementarity between the public and the private sector. We need to have more private finance to go towards such countries. It's a revolution in terms of practices and volume when it comes to collective investment. Now, the principles have been defined. Many concrete actions were launched last June, and my commitment was to follow up on that at this forum. So here we are. Many things have been done. I would like to thank President Ruto. There was an important summit in Nairobi on climate that took place recently. So they started implementing what we did. The Secretary General of the United Nations. So there was the summit in Marrakesh that you launched, and with the World Bank and made it possible to make progress on this point. So there's a whole series of initiatives that has been taken, very important milestones and concrete actions documenting the principles that we decided on. And just before the COP28 El-Sina that will take place in Dubai, we will keep structuring this agenda. So the goal of this first panel is to go back to things, to achievements, and to strengthen them, and then there will be a second panel to talk about the future. Dr. Singh, you have been commissioned by the Indian presidency of the G20. This Paris Pact for people in the planet. With Larry Summers, you drafted a report in the same line of international financial and for MDB. So I'll give you the floor first so that you can present your work and explain to us what will happen in the next few months in terms of reforms.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you for this honor and privilege to be part of this roundtable. The honor and privilege of Mr. President following the remarkable leadership which followed the summit which you had convened. And indeed, for the honor and privilege that how gratifying it is that your own team, after a careful study of the 2-volume report, which Larry and I had the of which we were the co-conveners with a distinguished group, found it to be a very worthwhile report in terms of taking the agenda forward and making fundamental changes. Now, as you correctly pointed out, that ever since your initiative, the last 6 months, Mr. President, has seen more changes in the last 6 months or 8 months than it has taken in many decades. Consider the following, Mr. President. Consider the fact that our first report and second report is already in the course of implementation. Consider that the initiatives of the World Bank in changing its matrix, with which it had a mindset of calling it a livable planet, in a report which they gave in Marrakesh. The change in nomenclature represents a kind of a mindset change. Consider that the African Development Bank is making pioneering efforts on hybrid capital. Consider, Mr. President, that the Asian Development Bank has announced by itself 100 billion through guarantees alone, that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has signed an agreement of $1 billion. The harmonization of EBRD and AIB and the Inter-American Bank's arrangement with the World Bank are important changes. We know that things, given your leadership and the leadership of the G20, Mr. President, has moved now in a very positive direction. We know, however, that roughly $5.4 trillion per annum is needed between now and 2030, of which Kristalina is aware that 2 trillion must come, alas, from domestic resource mobilization. And she will talk about this more, and some initiatives on that has begun. But coming to the 1 trillion, which must come half from private capital, half from concessional and non-concessional capital, how do we get this? This is the tectonic shift which we require. And this is the shift in terms of, I agree with you entirely when you said, Mr. President, that we are still much better off in restructuring the mindset, the processes and procedures of existing multilateral development banks, because they are a rule-based organization. They have generally served the world well. They are an extraordinary example, Mr. President, of very successful and creative financial engineering. Consider the fact that in a capital base of just 20 billion, the World Bank has so far done over 900 billion, which is a very efficient way of financial intermediation. Is that enough? No, it is not enough for 5 reasons, Mr. President, I submit to you. First, I think its record has been extraordinary in harnessing public capital by the factor which I mentioned to you. But in sharp contrast to that, its record in being able to harness private capital has been an extraordinarily poor one. That out of $1, you are just harnessing 0.6 of private capital. You can do that to 1.5 very, very effortlessly. You can optimize its balance sheet far more creatively than you have been able to do in terms of making it bigger, bolder, and better in multiple ways. And I think that the efforts which are being made to harness hybrid capital, private capital, guarantees, blended finance, offer the enormous scope of how much bigger it can become without too much additional capital outlays right at the beginning. And therefore, I think that our 2 reports taken, Mr. President, in conjunction, the triple agenda we call it the triple agenda. Triple what? Triple that moving away from mere poverty alleviation and shared prosperity to include the third factor, global challenges. That's the third item, not one as a substitute to the other, but the 3 taken all symbiotically. Triple in terms of possibility, the total finances which are available. Currently, which I mentioned to you, $120 billion is all that the multilateral development banks lend per annum. This can easily be tripled closer to 400 billion if you take concessional finance also to be triple. So triple in terms of finance, triple in terms of mechanisms, in being able to provide a new window, perhaps a more creative window, of being able to harness capital more innovatively. And of course, in all this process, private capital, Mr. President, will have to play an increasingly important role. That requires a mindset change. That requires the MDBs to work in tandem, in close harmony with each other. That requires in believing that the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. That will only happen, Mr. President, when the mindset change of the MDBs in multiple ways take place, and they are able to use the strengths of each other to be able to optimize the reach and ability to be able to do so. All these, Mr. President, requires changes in procedures, policies, approaches, incentive structure, and the manpower which is available. You, Mr. President, have provided amazing leadership in this effort. And it is your leadership which is going to guide, I believe, the agenda forward. There is great synergy between the vision of the current G20 presidency and your own vision, Mr. President, which will lead us, hopefully, to a more optimistic end. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you for your report, your work, and I want to commend the G20 presidency of India, because I think this agenda is very inspiring, and we made a lot of progress, and I know how much Brazilian presidency wants to follow up on that, and you're right to create this common dynamic and all the synergies between having a better mobilization of the existing balance sheet and reforming global governance of IMF, World Bank, and our global institutions, because they have to be much more inclusive and much more efficient. And as one of the founding members of this institution, I do believe in this reform in depth. Let me perhaps follow up with you, Kristalina, Madame la Directrice Générale. Because more than 2 years ago, you launched this idea to issue largely more than 650 billion SDRs or equivalent, in order precisely not just to raise capital, but to reallocate for rich countries this capital toward poorest countries of this world. It took time, but we did it thanks to your leadership. And more than that, you committed a few months ago to as well reorganize your way to function with World Bank, to optimize the synergies. And de facto, you already started this big change. So what is your view on the role of the IMF? Where do we stand regarding SDRs and this policy, about the funds you created in order to help poor and developing countries facing this type of challenges I mentioned? And what about the future? Kristalina.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start with a big hooray for the courage of conviction that even in the toughest of times, we can work for a better world. Thank you for that, Mia. Thank you. In 2030, John Maynard Keynes wrote an essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. It was in the midst of depression, and the Second World War was ahead of the world then. And yet, he stood against pessimism. He said, we can make the lives of our grandchildren better. And that is what I strongly believe we need today. But we can only succeed if actions speak louder than words. So, what is our scorecard? What we have achieved? First, we have indeed exceeded the on-lending of SDRs, the pledge we made. We pledged 100 billion. We are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 106, 107, and counting. How did we do it? By creating healthy competition to do good. You started it. First, there was this pledge to on-lend 20%. You said, no, we are going to go to 40. And what happened next was Canada said we would do 48. Spain said we are going to do 50. And my call is everybody that can do more, please do. Why? And that is the second point. Because what we are achieving is to take a dormant asset, one that is asleep in central banks, and we are turning it into resource for developing economies to step up. What we have today, $55 billion on lending to our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. This makes it possible for the fund to provide zero interest rates lending on scale. And I look at the president of Ghana. We lent Ghana $3 billion. We would have not been able to do more than $1 billion if we didn't have that resource. Second, we now have over $40 billion in our Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which provides long-term, 20 years, concessional finance, 10.5 years grace, low interest rate, to vulnerable to climate change countries, not only to low-income countries, but also to vulnerable middle-income countries. Where we are today, in record time, we have 11 programs. Senegal is among them. Barbados is among them. Out of these 11 programs, 6 are on the continent of Africa, where most of the vulnerabilities, unfortunately, lie. 3, we reached out to our members and we appealed for compassion. In this world of more dramatic shocks, the most vulnerable countries and their most vulnerable people must be helped. So we ask for subsidies so we can provide the zero interest rate loans more generously. And Emmanuel, you know what, it warmed my heart. We have more than doubled the contributors to our subsidy account. We now have countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Indonesia. We have almost all the Gulf countries that never before contributed. You stepped up, and so did many others. Compassion is a valuable thing always, but in the world we live today, even more so. Last but definitely not least, everybody who sees me these days says, you know, what happened to you? You're in such good mood. I'm in great mood because our membership agreed to increase by 50% the quota resources of the IMF so we can be financially strong. So when we provide support to Jordan, as we just concluded staff level agreement, 1.2 billion, we can do it. We can do more for Egypt, countries that are currently at such a high risk. Just to give you a sense, what is 50%? This is predictable resources for the fund to respond to shocks as they occur. 2020 COVID, we lent 160 billion. 2022, war in Ukraine, we lent 160 billion. With this predictable resource, one that we can rely on, I feel so much more comfortable in our more shock-prone world. So 6 months, 6 big actions. And I look forward, Emmanuel, you call us in 6 months. I'm a little, okay, we need to come up with 6 more, and we will.
Thank you. Merci, Kristalina. C'est très concret.
Thank you, Kristalina. This was very practical, very concrete, and you're very enthusiastic.
Apologies. And now we have a third chair for Sub-Saharan Africa to represent the continent much better.
Beginning of the reform. Début de la réforme de gouvernance.
The beginning of the governance reform at the IMF and beyond what you just mentioned. These decisions allow for very concrete actions on key countries here represented, but this also allows, this is related with the war, and this was discussed yesterday. Everything is linked, and today we have vulnerable countries which, if they're not helped by the international community, will be engulfed in the current conflict. And the action of the IMF in Jordan within the current conflict context is essential, and this would not be possible if we hadn't strengthened these resources, as Christina just said. And now let me turn on to President Jin. This is collective work, and we have international financial institutions. Of course, this is all very good and well, but we have banks as well. You are the president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and you are part of what was included in the Paris Initiative for the People and the Planet. This is entitled Finance in Common, the gathering of all development banks, regional banks, intercontinental banks to move along this collective work alongside the IMF and the World Bank to develop synergies and leverage. And beyond what was said today, I wanted to hear you on the role of your bank, the role of what we do in common, and what you do to alleviate poverty. President Jin.
Thank you, President Macron. Thank you very much. It's my first opportunity to attend the Paris Peace Forum, but I was here in June under your leadership to attend the meeting, very much important new Global Financial Pact. And Mr. President, thank you very much for your astounding leadership. And I can also tell everybody here that much has been achieved since the meeting in June. We're not simply talking, it's not talking shop, it's a workshop, because we work together. And first of all, I remember you want us to be bigger and bolder and getting better job done. And I think we are all working very hard. Now I'm stepping in for my friend President Ajay Banga today. He couldn't make it for a very special reason, and actually it's very nice for me to be here for him. I hope I will speak in the same voice as Ajay's, and I will check with him whether I spoke rightly. But I can tell you, Mr. President, that we really work together as a system. And since you call on us to work together to do better, and we really started to work at the system. For instance, very close cooperation has been achieved, and Mr. Singh referred to the $1 billion finance guarantee for the World Bank's program. Now, this $1 billion guarantee is not a big amount, but we help the World Bank to release the resources to do new financing. And we are working actually to do more. And also, I think the financing for Commons Coalition is also making very good progress. And I think the achievements in Cartagena following the meeting here, I think is demonstrative of the actions we can take together. Actually, we are trying our very best to bring the coalition to Asia. And I'm very much willing to host 2024. To that end, I certainly have to mobilize more support from the partners and other MDBs. But I think it's very much important. I think the essence of working together is just to get more financing for development, for climate change mitigation adaptation. Now, we all know that this Financing Commons coalition has $23 trillion in assets and 10% of the total annual financing flows. This is a huge amount of money. And if we only work with the MDBs as a small group, it's very much limited. By working together, and we can mobilize huge amount of resources to develop shared programs which can promote global prosperity, development, and in particular, climate change mitigation adaptation. So I think leadership is important because leadership would guide us to do whatever is needed. But then we follow by actions, coordination, cooperation, and implementation. So I've been in the development work for the last 4 decades, and I have never seen such kind of momentum, such kind of shared vision and cooperation. Now, Kristalina is here. We also work with you. When we provide financing to some of the risky countries, highly indebted countries, we check with IMF. What is the best approach, right? Not simply giving them money, building even higher indebtedness. So working together as a system, Mr. President, we believe this is very much important. Thank you very much for your leadership. And lastly, I would like to say a few words about this bank. France is one of the first countries to participate in the negotiation of the bank. European countries are not simply to join the bank which is established already. European countries join in the making of the rules, in the negotiation of the Articles Agreement, and we have the principle of being lean, clean, and green. So this is the, I would say, the great achievement of the cooperation among all of the shareholders. And I'm very much confident we can do more together. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I can assure you we will continue to work together and do even better. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor to President Charles Michel. As the President of the Council, he was head of the dual action of heads of states and governments in Europe, which took action for climate and biodiversity, and also he states work with other countries and the international level. So let us see how the EU defends both of these agendas. What are the progress accomplished since last events? Thank you very much, Mr. President. There's a strong political will that mobilizes all. I'd like to give a nod to what was said by Angel Gurria and our young activists from Lebanon. In very eloquent words, they describe the world we live in today. And we are living a triple shock. This was very well said. First, the shock of nature, climate change, COVID-19, this is an illustration of this, ocean, biodiversity, forests, glaciers. We have a strong responsibility in that regard. And then technological shocks, AI, generative AI, these are disruptive technologies. And the third shock, a new world based on rules and multilateral action, and the temptation to look inward and turn one's back on this world. So thank you, Mr. President, for your leadership to stay on the front lines and continue believing in these ideas, but also in taking action. And we'll see in a few moments what are the deliverables. And Kristalina had very eloquent words on this, showing that the direction you said brings strong results. And a few words now on the EU. We believe that due to our DNA, we have a strong responsibility for more cooperation in defending fundamental values, human dignity. We should not choose between fighting against poverty, helping young children go to school. We should reconcile this with protecting the planet. And if we are to be credible, we need to be credible on funding. How should we mobilize more funding? And how we ensure that in this world there are not a few countries deciding for the rest. And Kristalina said this very well. The openness in a new form of governance at the IMF is very essential. I'm very happy that together we convinced the G20 to welcome the African Union very quickly. This is a paradigm change for the G20, and I want for the African Union to develop more cooperation to defend forcefully the voice of Africa in facing these global challenges. And at the EU level, I think we have a strong responsibility to forge a unity of the 27 heads of states and governments. This is what we do together to make sure that we have a bigger impact in the world. DTS, this is very important. We continue on this front. We will need to go further to develop our capacities, and this is essential because for the World Bank, for example, the World Bank as of today, proportional to GDP, it is 7 times less capitalized, less funded than before. So this is very clear what we have to do. We need to mobilize capacities. The private sector must be mobilized in a smart way. We need governance, predictability, fighting against corruption, but this also means that will be likely that we will have to raise capital. This will be a debate sooner or later. So as you see, the EU is an active member of the international community. In a few months, I'm happy to have the opportunity to meet Kristalina and others to see what progress we have made. And I think you just mentioned Paris was the capital of resistance and love, and let us make Europe into a bigger key for progress and prosperity. This is our common desire. Thank you very much. Thank you, President Tidden. The commitments we mentioned in Paris a few months ago, there was this idea, international taxation dedicated to the growth of this funding. This was picked up in the Nairobi Summit by President Ruto, and I'd like to give the floor to Laurence Tubliana with the Climate Foundation organization is working on this in the run-up to the COP28. Thank you, Mr. President. I heard you with a great deal of optimism. Many taboos were taken down. Kristalina, we know that DTS were a difficult topic. The mobilization of NDPs was a difficult topic. So
this implementation of Paris Summit could be a hope, not hate, which is exactly what we are looking for. I think every country in this room is here because we recognize that we need drastically increase the scale of climate finance available to support developing and vulnerable countries' transition to the low carbon and resilient positive economy, while addressing the adverse effect of climate change, including, of course, the loss and damage. And we know we need much more money than we are together on the table. This means that climate finance today only provides a fraction of what is needed, and that it could scale up really quickly to avoid the worst impact of climate change. It's not for tomorrow, it's really for today. But the cost of inaction, again, is much higher and will continue to rise. So it was really great to see, in particular in the V20 Accra Marrakesh agenda, the Nairobi Declaration, and of course the Paris Pact for People and Planet all have an action on new taxation option as a way to scale up financing for climate and development. And we know that international taxation is a taboo in many, many countries for many reasons: sovereignty, difficulty of implementation, and different interests. But we need, and it can provide additional finance at scale to support just and equitable transition while, and it's so important, addressing inequalities, correcting some of the inequities of our current financial system, and ensuring that the most polluting industries, dear Angel Gurria, this Matthias Kormann, polluters pay principle, such as fossil fuel companies, start contributing to the fight on climate change and repair damages. Finally, France and Kenya have decided to launch the Task Force on International Taxation to scale up development and climate action. Mr. President, I think we can launch that with a coalition of countries at COP28 at the very beginning, when you will be there with many other colleagues, head of states. We need joint forces to raise additional funding in an equitable way, and not putting the burden on developing countries, of course, because that's the concern some are feeling, and ensuring that any adverse impact is addressed. And finally, the task force is a positive solution, an opportunity for countries from all regions to join forces and agree on a new and additional way of financing climate and public goods that would bring more fairness to the global system. We need positive solution in this particular geopolitical context. So countries in the room, join us, France and Kenya, and the V20 in their efforts to endeavor and champion international taxation option, funding for climate and development, and understanding very well we find different solutions because, of course, the sovereignty and taxation is that's the very base of the tax system. But we need now to make this taboo disappear. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Laurence.
Thank you very much, Laurence. This concludes the first panel. Lots of progress done, much to be accomplished ahead. We have had the Indian presidency, there will be the Brazilian presidency of the G20. We will need to continue with reform, with concrete actions in mobilizing our banks, international institutions, multilateral development banks, so that this all leads to very practical action in the way of funding. I'd like to stress one thing. Simultaneous to reform of governance, we should continue with our capacity to help local actors. There are many NGOs here, and we need to continue helping local actors. So there's on the one side billions and billions we talk about, and actions that change lives for people on the ground. And this is very much part of our agenda. Thank you very much to us four speakers, and thank you to all contributors.
In the first panel, to get back to their seats, and President Macron to remain on stage. And I will now welcome the participants in the second panel. I would be happy to have on stage President Akufo-Addo from Ghana, who is chairing the Vulnerable 20 group, the V20 group this year. Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, who has been a key advocate of the reform agenda, obviously, with the Bridgetown agenda launched in late July 2022. And Prime Minister Alexander De Croo from Belgium, who could present the main priorities of the incoming Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union, as well as Belgium's ambitions for COP28 and beyond. The aim, as President Macron said, of the second panel is to present the priority objectives that we must pursue in the coming month, starting with the ambitions for COP28, starting in just a couple of weeks. But before we start the discussion, before we start the panel, I would like to invite you to listen to Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, who has sent us a message in line with the priorities of his new agenda for peace, and highlighting the need for reforming our global financial architecture to achieve climate justice, starting at COP28.
Excellencies, dear friends, I'm happy to greet the Paris Peace Forum once again. You are meeting as our world is confronting a host of existential threats. Conflicts are raging, our planet is burning. The Sustainable Development Goals are slipping out of reach, and divides between North and South, East and West are deepening, and the risk of a great fracture is looming. Make no mistake, no country can meet these challenges alone. We need to bridge divides, rebuild trust, and leave no one behind. We need strong, renewed multilateral institutions that are adapted to today's world. As your team suggests, we need to move from a world of rivalry to find common ground. Seeking common ground means rethinking our approach to peace and security by addressing the root causes of conflict and preventing the seeds of war from sprouting. That is why I have called for reform of the Security Council and put forward ideas for a new agenda for peace based on the UN Charter and international law. The new agenda for peace calls on all countries to recommit to a world free of nuclear weapons, to maximize the convening power and good offices of the United Nations to bridge geopolitical divides, to link national actions for peace with progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, to put women's leadership and participation at the center of decision-making and commit to the eradication of all forms of violence against women, to make peacekeeping nimbler and more adaptable with forward-looking transition and exit strategies from the start, to support peace enforcement action by regional organizations, notably the African Union, with Security Council mandates and predictable funding, and to establish new governance frameworks to manage emerging threats, including lethal autonomous weapons that function without human control. But preventing conflict is also strongly linked with sustainable development and human rights. Seeking common ground means transforming a global financial architecture that is outdated, dysfunctional, and unjust into a system that is truly universal and serves as a global safety net for developing countries in trouble. Seeking common ground means cutting emissions and ensuring climate justice for those who did least to cause the crisis but are paying the highest price, starting at the COP28. Seeking common ground means ensuring that the emerging revolutions in technology, such as artificial intelligence, work for all of humanity. And seeking common ground means answering my call to action to put human rights at the heart of our work. Dear friends, we have a common responsibility to achieve common ground for our common good. At a time of rivalry, let us work together towards a more just, sustainable, and peaceful future for all, and I thank you.
If we speak about the future and what's next, obviously COP28 is absolutely critical in the coming weeks, and as it will frame as well on a series of actions that will to come. Mrs. Prime Minister, you played a very important role for this 4Ps because you, with your initiative, the Bridgestone initiative and your agenda, you set up the scene. And you were one of the very first one to precisely insist on this dilemma between fight against poverty and climate change, insisting on vulnerability as well. What are your main, not just, I would say, intention for COP28, but the action plan for COP28? And what are the critical actions to be delivered by our pact and all the countries being part of it for the weeks, the months, and the years to come? Mia, thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let me say that 6 months ago when we met here, I indicated that we were making progress, but just not fast enough. We're a little faster, but still not fast enough. And I want to thank those who spoke in the last panel, because as you can see, things have happened. And I want to commend you for your leadership on this matter, because even after we listened to the Secretary General just now, it is so easy for us to lose focus. But I am an eternal optimist, and I want to commend the young lady from Lebanon who spoke this morning, who both in her passion and language captured the moment. I do believe that peace will come, and I do believe that the planet will be saved. The question is, at what cost? And whether we have not learned the lessons of a century ago. The truth is, that the conflicts that are increasing are threatening to delay our rendezvous with saving humanity and saving the planet. And that means that more lives will be lost, lives that we will not see on television, as we are seeing now, but they will be lost nevertheless. Against that backdrop, therefore, we have to call for continued pace. And your voice is critical because there is too much distraction on the basis of geopolitics and on the basis of domestic politics from the real battles. We cannot save the planet with a quarter or half the people of the world working together. We need the majority. And if the majority is distracted in conflicts, if the majority is distracted in just being able to eke out a living, one of the things that we don't talk about is food and water security. And food and water security is a daily battle. And human beings can't survive without access to it for a long period of time. So that it bothers me, and I want to commend you and President Ruto, as we just heard, for the task force which is being set up. But I want to ask you to broaden it. And I want to ask you not to focus on climate alone, because in Paris we agreed planet and people. And to not allow us, or indeed the international media, to suck us into what is sexy on the reporting of the issues of the world. Because then we'll focus on COP and the climate and the lights, but we'll forget people. If we're going to agree that there needs to be a new mechanism for funding beyond that which we have now at the domestic levels and the public ODA, then we need to also recognize that there are competing interests for global public goods. And while climate and loss of biodiversity is perhaps the most urgent and certainly one of the greatest ones, food and water security is critical. Providing for the victims of conflict and what happens to them, whether in Africa, whether in the Middle East, whether in Europe, whether in Latin America, we need to be able to ensure that there is a capacity to reabsorb people who cannot on their own make their way because of them being victims of conflict. And then we need to be able to recognize that the ones who were not seen in the pandemic, who have lost, have been our children, and that the digital divide that precluded them from having access to regular education for the better part of 3 years can be totally destructive if we don't reintegrate them back into their societies by giving them a platform and opportunity for learning. So I've broadened the response a little bit because I feel that as you embark on this critical work for finding an international source of funding for global public goods, that we need to frame the parameters properly and to ensure that we can find ways, and of course the readiness for pandemics, which is the fifth one that I didn't include, not just the ones that will come as a result of climate because of the impact of warming, but also the slow motion pandemic of the antimicrobial resistance, which will reverse a century of medical progress, much of which has been developed here in this country. And if we don't get it right, it means that people may save the planet, but die from something else that ought not to have been a threat to humanity. I say these things conscious that as we focus now, as we go into COP, on the capitalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, it cannot be the only matter that we are seeking to raise funds for. And we are in danger of people saying, as they say to me often, well, you said you wanted X, but now you're asking for Y. Well, we're asking for X and Y, but you may only have heard X. And therefore, it is important to state what the world needs now. We also have to be aware that we really ought to have been going with COP to COP with a record and not a promise. And my fear is that the record is not yet strong enough to keep the world's trust in the process. And to that extent, it may well be fortuitous that there is not a country that has come forward to offer to host COP29 yet, and we may have to see COP28 as phase A and COP29 as phase B, and to ensure that we keep the momentum up, because I'm not sure that we can reach safety in the month that is left to properly capitalize the loss and damage fund. It is going to be interesting to see what level of public funding comes from the developed world, but we're also going to need to be able to utilize the output of your task force to help capitalize the loss and damage fund as well. I don't know that we are having the conversations at a wide enough basis. The oil companies are not our enemies. They're run by people that look like you and me. And if they look like you and me, then we ought to be able to sit around the table and define a win-win situation, unless they have a secret file, as I keep saying, as to how we can live on the planet Mars. And if they don't, then it means that it is not incapable of resolution. We need to sit around a table together. And it cannot be a handful of people who the world does not know or does not recognize. It has to be transparent if we are going to build trust among the global population. And let me be clear, we're not asking to bankrupt anybody, because it is not in our interest to bankrupt enterprises that employ people and that add value to countries' ability to finance their way to net zero. But what we are asking is that which we were told as children, that give a little, 3 cents, 5 cents, 2 cents in each dollar can make a huge difference. And it's not just oil and gas. As I said, if we're going to broaden the framework for global public goods, then it's big pharma, then it's big tech, then it's those who are working on AI. And similarly, it's the enabling environment of what I call the fit companies: finance, insurance, and transport. And if we can get everybody to carry a little weight, then I believe that at least on the provision of oxygen and capital, we can see progress. And I want to not only commend you, but I also want to commend my brother, from President of Ghana, who has put life back into the V20 movement and who has really refocused the fact that if we divide the countries of the world on the basis of per capita income, we're not going to be able to ensure that the funds go to those who are most vulnerable and most in need. And as it relates to vulnerability, we need to find the political will to recognize that a broad-based multidimensional vulnerability index will just be all things to all people and will not solve the problem. And we need to isolate what is the vulnerability for climate if we're dealing with climate. What is the vulnerability for water shortages if we're dealing with that? What is the vulnerability for public health? And let us deal with that. And I ask that we focus on these things going forward, because in so doing, then I do believe that that peace and that saving of the planet, when we reach it, will not see the loss of life and the loss and the incalculable damage that is likely to come. What is my greatest fear? That those countries like my own and many in Africa and Latin America and in the Pacific will become uninvestable and uninsurable. And we've seen the evidence of what will happen because already in California, insurance companies are not underwriting risk for fire. Will that happen in Greece? We've seen it happen with respect to them retreating in Florida and increasing premiums in the Caribbean. And to that extent, will we be able to see ordinary business conducted when access to finance is critical to move them to the next stage, but they can't get insurance? And that is why, and I end on this, that the debt pause clauses that the World Bank embraced here in Paris in June cannot be prospective. They have to relate to existing debt. If they don't relate to existing debt, it means that the countries who are intended to benefit from it cannot benefit from it for another 10 to 15 years. And secondly, they ought not to attract a premium. And I would only appeal to the World Bank and other institutions to recognize that to charge a cost for the restructuring of debt, well, not even restructuring, because that's what's causing them to have problems, but for the agreement to pause debt payments for 2 years, that to charge for that is an example of a modern Shylockian Merchant of Venice scenario that ought not to be part of the future of the characteristics of international finance. You cannot profit when people are on the ground. And I'm sure that His Holiness would agree that that type of behavior will reflect the worst of humanity. And I therefore say simply, let us get the debt clauses right, because with reducing insurance coverage and with underinsurance, governments are going to have to step up to the plate to provide the relief and the rebirth of so many different sectors in our economy, and therefore they will need the fiscal space. The last point is this. I'm sorry. You're forcing us to borrow as developing countries for something that we did not create, and we know that. But when you add debt, it then crowds out what we must borrow for to develop our people. And therefore, it cannot be fair. And if that is going to be the case, then I ask us to listen to those voices like Jeffrey Sachs, who simply say that we need now to move lending to a longer term and lower tenor. We cannot be having short-term borrowing at high costs if we're going to meet the development needs and the climate crisis adaptation at the same time. So if we are not going to receive grant funds for something we didn't create, which at law we should, then at the very least, let us move to 30 and 40-year loans that will give us the space to be able to provide for our people while building up the resilience that we need. If we can get those things in either phase A of COP28 or phase B of COP28, then I think we will have achieved significant progress on top of that which you have achieved and what the IMF has. And Christine, I have to salute you because you have carried the fund into a different pathway, and it has seen people for the first time, particularly with the provision of long-term funding for vulnerable middle-income countries, that wasn't there. So I apologize for the length of time I took, but I really do believe that these things are absolutely essential to the stability of the planet and to the winning of the peace that is necessary for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. You made a very clear link between, indeed, what is on the short run on the agenda and what makes vulnerability from economic and social point of view and climate point of view, because both, in fact, are converging and create the same impact on people. And it's clear that we have to rethink in depth, not just the global governance, but as well the articulation with private sector to be sure that we meet with these requirements. And you made a perfect transition to Nana Akufo-Addo, Mr. President, because you're president of Ghana, but as well president of V20 and these vulnerable countries. And Prime Minister Motley started to insist on the multi-factors of vulnerability, but as well insist on the fact that this is a huge agenda for your countries and all of us. So what's your view, not just on COP28, but the agenda to come, the first action we took, but where should be our priority in order to allow just the V20 to succeed?
Mr. President, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and the organizers of the Peace Forum for the invitation to participate for the first time in the work of this important organization. But I think I have also to join those who have spoken before in commending you for the stance that you have taken in trying to address some of the critical issues of our world today, and for the boldness of your leadership. There are many others in your position who are not speaking out on some of these matters, but you are speaking out, and more than speaking out, acting. And I think that that is really a matter for strong commendation, and we want to wish you the very best of luck in continuing this journey. It cannot be easy for you, having regard to what's going on here and in the rest of the world. But it is important that that work is being done and that you have stepped up to do that work. In the same way that Prime Minister Motley identified the work that the Managing Director of the IMF is doing, I want to add my voice to it, that we're seeing a situation where the calls that some of us have been making for transformation in the way the Bretton Woods organizations work is being heeded, and being heeded not just in resolutions, but in concrete actions that are being taken. And that's somebody else also that needs to be very strongly commended, is the Kristalina Georgieva, for the work that she's doing in this area. And at the end of the day, what is the critical part of this work for us? And I speak for us, for those of us on the African continent. That at the moment when we are looking to make this transformative development that we need to do to tackle issues of mass poverty and underdevelopment, we're told that some of our most important resources can no longer be deployed for our development. Our oil, our gas resources, which are there in abundance, can no longer be deployed because of its impact on climate change. So that for us is a critical issue we have to look at. If indeed we are being told that these resources that have helped develop other parts of the world are no longer going to be available for our development, how then do we make the transition to the new source of power and development? And it's clear we don't have the resources to do that. There's just, whatever the reason for it, the resources are not just there. So we have to address the issue of financing and the resources for the climate transition in our part of the world. And if it is going to be a just and equitable transition, some position has to be found for the manner in which we can then utilize the resources that we do have. For us to be told that they have to be abandoned in its entirety is basically to telling us to continue to face a future of hopelessness. And that is not one that we can, in any equanimity, contemplate. We have to look at a situation whereby the transition that we're looking at takes into account the resources that we have. So we're having to have a look at this big question, and the major issue being the financing, the access to investment into financing. And I think there's something that we now, all of us, also ought to look at more strongly. And that is the role that the institutions like the bank, the fund, the World Bank, and the fund can play in helping to mobilize private capital to support the development of the world. We're all aware that there is so much more money in private hands than there are in the public institutions. And how can this larger amount of capital be made to work for and I have to agree with Prime Minister Motley that the matter cannot just be about climate change, because there are other matters that are of equal significance. In the last 3 months, Ghana has faced extraordinary rainfall patterns that we have never experienced in our history before. It has led to flooding and the spillage of our dam and to flooding of critical food-growing areas of our country. The soil is being destroyed in many parts of the country that is going to make replanting of food and the reuse of those lands a difficulty for us. If we don't take some very, very dramatic actions now, food supply in the years down the road, in 2, 3, 4 years' time, is going to be a major issue for the country. So that, for instance, is a matter of tremendous concern for us. How do we mobilize the capital to be able to deal with the food crisis that is on the horizon in Ghana? So the multiplicity of the issues confronting us also require a multiplicity of responses. But at the heart of all of those responses is a very simple, ancient issue: money. Yes, it doesn't change from century to century, from generation to generation, access to capital and to money. And I think that a lot of our energies, what we're looking at is how we can frame a new arrangement where the institutions, the multilateral institutions, like the bank, like the fund, can play in the process of mobilizing the greater resources that the world needs for its development. It's an easy thing to say, but a difficult thing to do. But it is important also that alongside the changes that have to be made is a change in mindset. Is it necessary for prosperity in Europe and in the West, in parts of Asia, to be predicated on poverty in the rest of the world, in Africa and other parts? Are the two necessary to live side by side? Is it possible that we can contemplate a world whereby all of us can live together on this planet in relative comfort, and that some people will not live in super comfort and other people in super poverty? That challenge to the thinking and the mindset of people is something that in our generation we have to address. Is it possible for us to create a world where all of us live together on this planet in relative ease? Well, the resources of the world are there. Never has there been a time when there has been greater abundance of technology, of wealth, of the development that we're seeing in many parts of the world. Is it, they have to be restricted to those parts of the world, or they can be made a universal and a global phenomenon? These are some of the matters that we're going to have to look at, and we have to make, because if we're going to solve these multifaceted problems and put ourselves in a position to hand over to the next generation and succeeding generations a more constructive and better world, we have to deal with these questions. So, Mr. President, you have been very much in the forefront of the thinking on many matters. I will leave you with this conundrum also to deal with. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Merci, Président.
Thank you, President.
Merci beaucoup, Président. Je vais maintenant donner
Thank
la
you so much, President.
au Premier ministre
Now I would
De
like
Croo,
to
qui
give
va
the
prendre
floor
dans
to
quelques
Prime
semaines
Minister De Croo in a few weeks. He will chair
nous dise, au-delà de
the
l'engagement
council.
de son pays,
And
comment
I
il voit
would
l'engagement
like
européen
him to tell us
sur
how
les
he
sujets qu'on vient
sees the European
d'évoquer,
commitment, beyond his commitment
l'agenda du
for
premier
his country.
semestre
It will be the
2024,
agenda
celui
of
de la
the
présidence
first
belge
half year of
du Conseil.
2024, is the Belgian chairmanship of the Council. Thank you, President. Thank you, dear Emmanuel, for inviting me here and for giving me the opportunity to talk to this audience. As a European country, and something that has been said already, we bear a responsibility that is huge. And that's a responsibility that we addressed. If we have a look at what happened in the past, European countries have been the #1 partner for the rest of the world in terms of volume and stability. No one globally invests more into climate change or development cooperation, and no other continent in the world invests more in trade and partnerships with the rest of the world. That's something we have done, and we will keep doing it, and we'll need to do it even more. So in this context, as politicians, we talk about what we know, our institutions, our MDBs. That's very important. But I think that we haven't talked enough about when we talk about the fight against climate change, for example, those who are going to take action, private entities, industries, and the strategy shouldn't be a strategy based on degrowth, negative growth. On the contrary, we'll need to do more with more technologies, more innovation, more but better. I want to be clear. It's not just more compared to what we did in the past, but more of something new. And as a European country, I think that we have a lot of ambition. The Green Deal, in my opinion, is good, and I think that we shouldn't have an ambition that's smaller. I do not share this opinion. So the question is our ambition and how we help our industry to achieve that. As a European country, there's one instrument that's lacking. And I think that what happened in the USA really put a mirror in front of our faces. For example, if we want our European industry or European technology to play their role, and to be shared with the rest of the world, we need something else in Europe. I think that in Europe, we have a tendency to regulate a lot. We regulate quite well. And you know, there's this comparison with the USA.
Europe is a continent of sticks.
So, in the USA, you know, it's a continent of carrots, we work on incentives, and in Europe, it's more on regulation. But in Europe, we need more incentives as well to help our industry play this role. And that will be the priority of the Belgian presidency. How do you combine ambition regarding climate and economic and industrial development? I'm an optimist when it comes to innovation and technology. I know that in this context, sometimes we're being challenged. Next year, or maybe in 2025, 2026, there will be this peak carbon. So in 2025, 2026, at a global level, we will start having fewer carbon emissions than the year before. Who would have thought that? It's stimulating for technology. It's stimulating for economic and industrial growth. It's going to be better, and that's the solution. As Europeans, we have a key role to play on our continent, and that's something that then we should share with the rest of the world. I think that's why we stand out. Europe is a thriving continent, but it's a thriving continent that understands that the priority of the rest of the world is also our priority. We are going to achieve it, but in partnership with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, and I agree that now we have to deliver what we committed to do, and on top of that, we have to help a lot of emerging and developing countries to get rid of coal. I think if we have one key priority, and through innovation, we can do a lot of that in order to reduce these emissions. It guides you to the conclusion of this session as well, before the real conclusion regarding the Paris Pact for People and Planet. I mean, collectively, you delivered a lot of results. From the SDRs, now $110 billion or equivalent in order to finance much more, from an actual ecosystem of financing. Now, the swap you asked for regarding the debt to take into consideration vulnerabilities, now clearly taken into consideration by both World Bank and IMF, to the index of vulnerability, which is brand new, to all the initiatives mentioned. So we already had a series of actions making very clear that we progressed during the past 6 months. Now, we have to accelerate.
There's one matter, Emmanuel, and I think your scientists have done a lot of work on it, and that is methane. And we need to treat the methane as the urgent matter to be resolved, because quite frankly, it's a win-win for oil and gas companies. It's a win-win on waste to energy. And on agriculture, we can change the practices. And the scientists are saying that if we get methane under control in the same way that we treated to the Montreal Protocol in the past, we can have a better chance of containing to 1.5.
This is a fair point on top of what I mentioned on coal. You're right. And to take your word, we will dare. We will dare facing this issue, getting rid of coal and working on methane, as you mentioned. We will dare protecting our forests and increasing and delivering the whole agenda. And in order to do so, I mean, we now have the chance to, let's say, organize the follow-up of the process. And yesterday, the OECD took a very bold decision. So let me invite Secretary General Corman and President Macky Sall to join us on the scene for conclusion, because
I will now invite participants in the second panel to join their seats, and then we'll move to the conclusion of the panel. Thank you.
Come on.
Thank you very much. And we're calling on stage President Macky Sall from Senegal and Secretary General of the OECD, Mathias Corman, for the concluding remarks.
Now, as I mentioned, so all of the leaders being present played a very important role on top of the banks and the ecosystem, but our intention was clearly to structure the follow-up. And Mathias, perhaps I will give you the floor on the decision you took at the OECD.
Monsieur le Président Emmanuel Macron, Monsieur
President Emmanuel Macron, President Macky Sall, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, last June, the Summit for a New Financial Pact laid the grounds for an in-depth reform of the financial system, the international financial system, because, as the President said, no country should have to choose between reducing poverty and fighting against climate change and preserve biodiversity. We need financial institutions that are adequate for our goals in order to tackle global targets that are constantly changing. We need to get the right resources, the right finance to reach our SDGs and our global public goals while organizing a structured green transition and reaching our climate goals on the basis of strong development and resilient, inclusive economic growth.
Since our meeting in June, the OECD has been actively engaged in supporting the implementation of the summit's roadmap. First, on strengthening domestic resource mobilization, a key source of financing for development. We have continued our work together with developing countries through the inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting, with more than 140 member countries, and through the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, with 168 member countries, to ensure developing countries participate on an equal footing in setting global tax standards which support improved domestic resource mobilization. The landmark two-pillar international tax agreement will bolster public finances with the new 15% global minimum corporate tax alone estimated to raise up to $200 billion US in additional revenues each year. Importantly, the global minimum tax will ease the pressure on developing countries to introduce wasteful tax incentives, allowing developing countries to strike a better balance between mobilizing domestic resources and attracting critically important investment. Last month, we opened the multilateral instrument to implement the subject to tax rule for signature. That rule will be a key tool for developing countries to protect their tax bases and ensure multinational enterprises pay a minimum level of tax in their jurisdictions. And we will continue to support developing countries to increase their tax revenues through capacity building support to ensure they can truly optimize the revenue benefits from that important reform. And we will continue to expand our highly successful Tax Inspectors Without Borders initiative, working in partnership with the UNDP. Second, on improving the way we track development assistance to help boost financing to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Our Development Assistance Committee has agreed last week on new rules in relation to the treatment of private sector instruments in official development assistance, such as guarantees, equities, and loans to the private sector. By providing clear common rules in relation to private sector instruments in development assistance statistics, we are improving the incentives for Development Assistance Committee members to mobilize more and additional private resources through innovative mechanisms. It will also help foster a greater coordination among development agencies while setting a new international standard of transparency and accountability for development finance. And to complement these efforts, we will also launch the International Forum for Total Official Support for Sustainable Development at the OECD. Total official support for sustainable development has reached about $400 billion US per year, with just over $200 billion in official development assistance. It provides a more complete picture of donor and recipient efforts on sustainable development finance beyond ODI and of the opportunities to do more with private sector flows through official channels, global public goods financing, and triangular and south-south cooperation. Third, on helping policymakers scale up sustainable finance and investments, we will provide further tailored policy analysis for developing countries to mobilize private sector investment in infrastructure, leveraging experiences from our bilateral support to countries under our sustainable infrastructure program in Asia. This includes working with the African Union Commission to establish the African Virtual Investment Platform in April next year, which will support African countries in mobilizing investment for priority, sustainable investment projects and on optimizing the impact of these investments. In closing, Mr. President, I'm very pleased to announce that the OECD will further ramp up our active support for the effective implementation of the new Global Financing Pact Summit agenda by hosting the Secretariat of the Paris Pact for People and the Planet. By coordinating and monitoring support and by continuously reviewing, analyzing and reporting on progress, we will help ensure that the commitments made at the summit are translated into effective actions and outcomes. The Pact's Secretariat will help incubate ideas and coordinate with other international organizations, processes and fora. Starting at COP28 in a few weeks' time, but also through the G7, the G20, and in view of the UN Summit of the Future next year, or the International Conference on Financing for Development in 2025. Monsieur le Président Macky Sall,
President Macky Sall, at the OECD, we are impatient to work with you on this ambitious project. As you can see, the OECD is fully committed and will actively be engaged in this program. We cannot wait to start the work with you all to have practical results for the planet. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Secretary General. As you've understood, the OECD will play a key role for follow-up, and I think its expertise, its ability to ensure regular, rigorous follow-up in an independent way. It's not the president of the Paris Peace Forum who will say the contrary, dear Andrea, is really an asset, because that way we will see what is moving along and what is not. And this is also a platform that allows us to build very broad agreements for tax matters. For example, the great agreements that were reached were thanks to the OECD. So this is a perfect platform to work in synergy with the 4 Ps and to host this secretariat. And I'd like to give the words to President Macky Sall. In a few months, President Macky Sall will end his second term. I'd like to applaud his courage, his commitment, and the way he's an example in Africa, as he decided that democracy will continue in the country, and there are many competitors who will take over to continue with this democratic life in Senegal. There's no nothing is set as a rule. We see that African leaders are facing many difficulties, but with courage. And he took a major undertaking to send a special envoy of the 4Ps and to preside this follow-up committee. And President Macky Sall, thank you for accepting this appointment. Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in your respective capacities, I'd like to welcome, to applaud the leadership of President Macron and his proactive action on major issues that are great concerns for the planet: peace, climate, development, and inclusive finance. And you play an essential role. Let me stress it, because very often we don't speak much about our success, and really I'd like to stress it very formally. And I'd like to applaud the very relevant interventions this morning. Thank you to our speakers for interesting discussions. Many things to rejoice about since the Paris Pact, and good run-up to the COP28. I'd like to also salute our young Lebanese speaker for her words, and all the leaders as well. They are all saying the same thing. We need to have a paradigm change and welcome progress. Regarding the conclusion of the summit, if we want to think outside of the box, we will have to take proactive action, as you are, and reform to effect this paradigm change. Thanks to this, the G20 welcomed in its fold the African Union. I'd like to applaud the two leaders who supported first this proposal when I first suggested it, you, Emmanuel, and Jean-Michel. Then all the leaders of G20 followed along in supporting this initiative, which was enforced after 13 months between the first request and the accession. So this is to say, change is very much possible. The IMF proved it as well during the last General Assemblies in Marrakesh. The IMF decided to raise its funding in a substantial way and to give a third presidency to Africa. And I think very quickly, soon in December, we will raise the share. So kudos to you, Kristalina, and all the members. This means that the lines are shifting. Since 1946, we haven't felt the pace that there was these past few years since COVID. There was some progress, not enough. This is sure, but progress was made, and this needs to be amplified and strengthened to reach our goals. So these are two good reasons. The G20 showed it, the IMF proved it, the World Bank is on its way. I'd like to also salute the action of President Ajay and the bank and all multilateral banks. It is possible to reform the global financial architecture. It's all about mentality and political willingness, especially on the part of countries in the northern hemisphere, as they did it when it comes to reallocation of DTS. When the decision was taken, taken, everyone followed after that. So change is possible. And what we're asking, after all, is not a revolution. We're not asking for revolution. We are asking for an evolution, a change of mindsets, and a change in economic and financial governance in the world so that more people can participate and that the reality of the world can be better reflected. Some speak about a fragmentation between what we see in the BRICS country, the G7. Solution is not confrontation for developing countries. Solution lies with reforms in multilateral reforms. So let us work together towards this change of mindsets. Changing mindsets and paradigm change. These are the goals of the Paris Forum, as recalled the President, to set the way for the reform in the international financial system and the improvement of the protection of the planet and the mobilization of resources to help the most vulnerable countries in a cost-effective way. Our struggle is not ODA only. Of course, we need to do more on that front, but the need is so great that we cannot solve our countries only through ODA. We need to get thinking together on how to mobilize more resources under easier conditions. Mr. Modley said it. Longer terms, we need to pay back our debt on with lower interest rates. And this is why we think that one of the key thing will be to modify rules regarding exports at the OECD, and beyond what we can do on blended finance, consensual loans, the private sector, but also export credits. If we prolong the repayment terms, and if we also rework the insurance terms, because a big chunk of the money that is paid is part of insurance, and this needs to be reworked, because all countries here present are paying their debt despite their difficulties. There may be some delays, but they're paying. So we need to put this in perspective, really. And I think this is key to mobilize more resources and help developing countries in picking up the speed of development. I'd like to end on this point. The efforts by the OECD on abusive tax avoidance. As you know, in developing countries, there are many mineral resources, very often, or hydrocarbons. We inherited or obtained or accomplished through incentives. We created tax havens. And so companies that come in to exploit underground resources do not pay taxes or pay very little tax compared to the wealth that is created through this. So the OECD has worked a lot on BEPS to try to fight against tax havens and erosion. But if we manage to solve this equation, we will be able to mobilize a lot of resources for these countries that have a wealth of natural resources. And I think President Nana Akufo said this. The question of climate is a question of justice. We cannot ask countries where half of the population doesn't have access to electricity, countries with wealthy resources, gas, mineral resources. We cannot ask them, do not exploit it. We will not fund the exploitation of your gas because these are fossil fuels, fossil resources. This is wrong. This gas is liquefied and put on ships to be sent in the north. So there's injustice here. A very clear, glowing injustice. So there needs to be a rebalancing on of the question of fossil fuels. We cannot only say, okay, this is fossil energy, this is banned, while the North continues on with this. At this very moment, some northern countries continue to use coal, even coal. So the question of transition needs to be reworked a bit. Of course, I applaud the efforts of the G7, all the means to help energy transition in southern countries. Senegal benefits from this, so thank you, President, and other member countries. But I'm talking here about all developing countries and African countries that have very few financial resources, but a wealth of natural resources. They need to make up their lack of development, and they need to participate in protecting the planet. So let us find together the means to create a more sustainable and inclusive planet. I'd like to end also by saying that thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for those who nominated me as a special envoy for the follow-up of the Paris Pact for people and the planet. I accept with honor and humility this task, and I'll do my very best to contribute to this common struggle. Thank you very much.
Merci. J'appelle maintenant pour une photo de famille la première ministre de la Barbade, Elia Milan, la directrice générale du Fonds international, Kristalina Georgieva, le président du Conseil européen, Charles Michel, de même que le président de l'AIIB, Tin Lechu, et M. Nkassing. Voilà. And I will ask you to remain seated at this point. Is Prime Minister De Croo still here? No. Joindre un membre. Merci beaucoup, Président.